weeks ago, I covered a story about the Supreme Court passing a ruling about bribes. And I told you during that coverage that, of course, they're going to pass this because some of them are also taking bribes. So let's go back and let's reflect on that ruling, and then we'll get into the impeachment that's been filed by AOC. Let's go ahead and get into this. The U.S. Supreme Court just basically legalized bribery. Remember we talked about this? So here are all the justices. Dashing, aren't they? Corrupt, corrupt, corrupt. Did you know you could give your local government officials tips when they do things you like? Brett Kavanaugh thinks you can. In fact, if you're rich enough, says the Supreme Court, you can now pay off state and local officials for government acts that fit your policy preference or advance your interests. You can give them lavish gifts. Hold on to the word gifts. Send them on vacations or simply cut them checks. You can do all of this so long as the cash, gifts, or other gratuities are provided after the service and not before it. And so long as plausible deniability of the meaning and intent of those gratuities is maintained. So that was the ruling that was passed by the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago. And you'll notice here it was a 6-3 opinion that was issued. So I just wanted to highlight that once again as we go into this story about Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito and the articles of impeachment that have been filed against them. Now, I want to remind you first what happened with Clarence Thomas, just in case people may have forgotten. Last year, Clarence Thomas was called out for just this, for bribes. The Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, corruption is intolerable. Here's what we can do about it. This was from the LA Times, and this was August 10th of 2023. So this really wasn't that long ago. It's not even almost a year, but not quite. If you thought you could no longer be shocked by the lavish gifts conservative billionaires have reportedly bestowed on Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, Thursday's remarkable investigative report from ProPublica might surprise you. It reveals even more of the depth of Thomas' corruption. The report exposes Thomas had a pattern of secretly accepting private flights, yacht trips, and other luxuries from a cadre of super wealthy conservative donors over 3 decades in violation of legal and ethical standards. None of these donors knew Thomas before he joined the court. So, to that point, these are people that he met after he was already a Supreme Court justice. So by him accepting these gifts, obviously that makes him compromise. That also makes him corrupt. And this is what we've been saying before, that a lot of these officials are corrupt. I'm willing to bet that if you were to point out the politicians that are in Congress, federal judges, justices all across the country, I wouldn't be surprised if only a handful of them are actually not corrupt. I think a lot of these people have been bought, they've been paid for, and they are serving certain people. That's the donor class. So this shows you again, it's not just linked to politicians. These undisclosed gifts represent intolerable corruption within the highest court in the land. ProPublica reported that these wealthy benefactors have treated the justice to at least 38 vacations, including a previously unknown yacht trip around the Bahamas, 26 flights on private jets, helicopter rides, box seats at sporting events, and stays at luxury resorts. Now, here's the crazy part, folks. Supreme Court justices make a pretty good salary, more than many of you will ever make. Clarence Thomas can afford to buy box seats. Just is what it is. He'd probably get a discount just because he is SCOTUS. So these were the things that he accepted. Clarence Thomas can pay for his own vacations. Now, the private jets and all that stuff, do you really have to go on a private jet? Greed, corruption. This is where we're at. It goes on a little bit more to say, Thomas' misuse of his lofty position to enrich himself and live a life of luxury is just the kind of thing that has eroded the public's confidence in a crucial institution. The Supreme Court's perceived legitimacy has dropped to an all-time low. So, I would argue I didn't think a lot of these people were legitimate to begin with. That's just my take. You guys can let me know how you feel. Like I said, I would be surprised if you could find at least a handful of them around the country that are not corrupt, that have not accepted some type of bribe or gift. I would not be surprised. It goes on to say here, Thomas appears to have violated the law by failing to disclose these gifts, according to ethics experts. So why is that important? That was reported last year. And now fast forward to today, because now AOC has filed articles of impeachment against Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito. Let's go ahead and get into this clip here. Listen to this.
In the meantime here, we do want to get and stay on Capitol Hill there at Live Now Look back again in Washington. You're going to hear from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in just a moment here. Of course, the Democrat from New York, the Congresswoman, issuing and introducing today articles of impeachment against Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. In her statement, she says the unchecked corruption crisis on the Supreme Court has now spiraled into a constitutional crisis threatening American democracy writ large. She says this: Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito's pattern of refusal to recuse from consequential matters before the court, in which they hold widely documented financial and personal entanglements, constitutes a grave threat to American rule of law, the integrity of our democracy, and one of the clearest cases for which the tool of impeachment was designed. So this is quite interesting.
Pause there for just a second. Danny is spot on, and this is what I was going to bring up. Partisan shenanigans by Sandy. Yeah, because the reality is, here's the problem that I have with impeachment. I'm not against impeachment. But what I have noticed over, let's say, past 20 years, it seems like impeachment is being used in a partisan way. When we look back to Bill Clinton, for example, Bill Clinton was impeached. Now, impeached doesn't mean you're removed from office, but he was impeached. That was a partisan effort. That was led by Republicans, right? Now, granted, some of the Democrats, once they heard the story, once they heard about his affair there with intern Monica Lewinsky, some of them were like, okay, yeah, maybe this needs to be heard, as well. But it was initiated by the Republican Party. When Donald Trump was president, Democrats filed articles of impeachment or tried to impeach Donald Trump. That was a partisan thing. AOC trying to impeach Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito. This is a partisan thing. And then not only that, remember the story that I just told you about Clarence Thomas, that was reported in August of last year. Why weren't those articles filed last year? Because last year was not an election year. So don't forget, AOC is up for re-election. This is something that she can put under her belt and say, look at me, I filed, for impeachment against these two justices. And of course, they happen to be conservative justices. So my problem is, again, I have no problem with impeachment, but I've seen the way that it's been used over the past 20 so years, and it's been done in a partisan way. So ask yourself that question. If it were not election season, and if it were Democrat justices that were accused of doing these acts, would AOC file those articles of impeachment? Think about that.
Interesting here. I consider myself somewhat of a student of history. I am not entirely familiar with any precedent that there might be for such a move as this. A member of Congress, the Democrat there from New York, the Congresswoman, introducing articles of impeachment against two sitting Supreme Court justices here. Well, I'll stop talking. You can hear from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez herself on why she feels the need to do this and whether or not it can go anywhere. Here's AOC.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to introduce articles of impeachment against Associate Justices of the Supreme Court Clarence Thomas and Samuel Anthony Alito, Jr. Against Justice Thomas, the resolution includes 3 total articles: 1 count of failure to disclose financial income, gifts, reimbursements, property interest liabilities, and transactions, among other information, and 2 counts of refusal to recuse from matters concerning his spouse's legal and financial interests before the court. The second resolution includes the following impeachment articles against Justice Alito: 1 count of refusal to recuse from cases in which he had a personal bias or prejudice concerning a party before the court, and 1 count of failure to disclose financial incomes, gifts, reimbursements, property interests, among other information. Mr. Speaker, nomination and appointment to the Supreme Court is one of the highest privileges and most consequential responsibilities of our nation. Such an appointment is uniquely insulated in its power. Confirmation to the court is a lifetime appointment whereby justices are entrusted with decisions that powerfully shape the nation as well as the lives of every American. For this reason and others, the Constitution rightfully and explicitly holds justices to even higher standards than members of Congress or even the President. Section 1 of Article 3 of the Constitution commands federal justices to hold their offices during good behavior, in addition to its clauses barring treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And Congress has exercised its power to reinforce this higher standard of the judiciary before.
Now, let me pause here for a second. Don't you think it's a little too convenient that it happens to be her that filed for these articles of impeachment? Because anybody could have done this. This is AOC making a political career move. There's a reason why I waited to cover this story today, and I covered the story about DSA withdrawing their endorsement for her first. Because this story received so much national attention, I felt like it was overshadowing the fact that the organization that she's a part of withdrew their endorsement for her. So it was important for me that I covered the DSA story first before I covered this one. But this is a political career move for AOC. This is a way for her, again, to really make her name in DC. And I said this before. We all, I think a lot of us that supported Bernie and the squad, after that first year or so when they were in Congress, we started complaining a little bit like, whoa, what's going on? Like when AOC first came to Congress, she was very combative. Like she was protesting in Nancy Pelosi's office and all that kind of stuff. And then apparently somebody must have pulled her aside and gave her a talking to, because next thing we knew, she started falling in line and calling Nancy Pelosi Mama Bear. So she realized that she did want to be a career politician, regardless of what she said when she was running for office, when she said that she would find being a one-term congressperson. That was a lie. So how do you make your name in DC? You make your name by doing things like this. There are a lot of people in Congress. Most of them you've probably never heard of. I know I haven't heard of most of them. But have you ever noticed how there's certain names that you hear over and over? There's certain congressmen and women that you see on corporate media over and over and over. And then the other ones you never hear from. These are the people that have kind of been chosen. They've been selected to lead the way in Congress. So for AOC not to be the Speaker of the House or the minority leader of the House, and she's definitely obviously not a senator, don't you think it's a little bit strange how she gets so much attention? She's not the only squad member. She has been tapped to become the next Nancy Pelosi. And I predicted this 2 years ago when I saw the way that she was moving, when she tried to both sides. I'm going to be a little bit progressive now and not all the way progressive, because I still want to get along with Democrat establishment. So when she came into Congress, we all have to remember that was during Trump's presidential term. So if you are a self-described Democratic socialist and you are entering Congress during Trump's year and he's a Republican, it's easier for you to be combative when the leader in the White House is a Republican. Fast forward to Joe Biden taking the White House, and you notice how she fell back. She was not as heavily critical towards Joe Biden, even though there were a number of times that I called out on this show where Joe Biden was completely in the wrong. And AOC was not willing to call it out. She would run away from reporters. She would run away from protesters. And then finally, she got to the point where I support Joe Biden unconditionally. He's the nominee regardless. So she kept revealing herself over time. And then finally, it's just mask completely off, right? So this is her playing partisan politics. One of the ways to move up in the DC ladder, particularly in Congress, is by doing partisan stuff like this. This is not to say that Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito are not guilty. I think those mofos are. Let's just keep it real. But again, notice who was the one to bring forward these articles of impeachment. It was her. This is another way for her to move up in Congress. So do I think that AOC really cares desperately about what Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito did? Not really. I think she took this as an opportunity to make a name for herself and advance her political career. Whether you like her or not, you have to see what she's doing. AOC is not stupid. She's actually very smart. Let's go on.
This body has impeached and removed 8 federal judges for transgressions ranging from evading income tax and perjury to intoxication on the bench and abandoning the office to join the Confederacy. Perhaps most critical to the legitimacy of the institution, these judicial standards require justices to recuse themselves in any proceeding where their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. In other words, if a person could reasonably believe that the legitimacy of a justice's judgment could be or be perceived to be compromised due to their personal involvement in the case or its parties, the standard is clear. The justice must recuse.
Now, here's the problem that she may run into. The ruling that was just passed by the Supreme Court, that it is okay for public and state officials to take bribes. And I wonder if they'll be willing to use that to defend themselves. And don't get me wrong, Clarence Thomas is trash. Justice Alito is trash. I think they're absolutely awful. Now, I can't comment too much about Justice Alito and how he was appointed, but I do remember how Clarence Thomas was appointed. And I point to this because if you're going to come at Clarence Thomas, if you think he shouldn't be in the seat, I think it's only fair to call out the reason why he's there in the first damn place. When Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas, Joe Biden was the chairman of that committee that she testified in front of. Go back and watch the video footage. Joe Biden was the senator that refused to let Anita Hill's witnesses testify. If people would have been able to hear her witnesses testify, I don't think that Clarence Thomas would be sitting there right now. So people have Joe Biden to thank for that. A lot of people forget this. I didn't. So how can you sit there at this hearing and you have evidence? Anita Hill had evidence against Clarence Thomas, and you have witnesses that are ready to testify. And all it took was for Joe Biden to shut it down. These are things people cannot forget. And that's how Clarence Thomas got that seat. So Joe Biden let this corrupt Clarence Thomas walk right into the Supreme Court, a lifetime appointment. Let's go on a little bit more.
They are required to recuse. That stringent and sacred standard exists for the good of the ruling, the judiciary, and the country. Mr. Speaker, I believe that everyday Americans independent of party or ideology, can reasonably conclude that Justices Thomas and Alito's years-long pattern of misconduct and failure to recuse in cases bearing their clear personal and financial involvement represents an abuse of power and threat to our democracy fundamentally incompatible with continued service on our nation's highest court.
The same can be, thank you for that, Bryce. Expect this appointment or this impeachment to be shut down too. Thank you so much for that. The same can be said for Nancy Pelosi. The same can be said for Joe Biden. If we're talking about corruption, I mean, I don't know how many times we have to bring this up, but why is it okay for Nancy Pelosi to trade stocks? You can add Ro Khanna to that list too, even though he continues to tell people on Twitter, those are my wife's stocks. So you see how it's partisan? AOC would never bring forth these types of, this type of pressure towards Nancy Pelosi or towards Joe Biden or towards Ro Khanna because they're on her team. This is the problem with partisan politics. Did you know that the founders of this country did not want political parties? You know why they didn't want political parties? Because they knew something like this would happen. Because under political parties, the needs of the parties are put before the people. So this is why people end up backing their party even when they're in the wrong. So that's what I want you to ask yourself as you're listening to this speech from AOC. Would she have done this to Joe Biden? Talk about the business dealings between Joe Biden and Hunter Biden with Burisma in Ukraine. There's this miles-long paper for that. If I remember correctly, there were House representatives on the Republican side that wanted to impeach Joe Biden over that. AOC spoke out against it and said, no, because he's on her team. Partisan politics every damn time.
For the good of the institution and the nation, absent resignation, they must be removed. The proof is undeniable, and here I will lay it out. Justice Clarence Thomas, for decades now, has carried on a close, financially entangled personal relationship with real estate billionaire Harlan Crow. It is of material importance to the American people to note that Justice Thomas's relationship to the billionaire only began after Thomas's powerful appointment to our nation's highest court. The cash, goods, and services Justice Thomas received over the years include large loan balance cancellations, tuition payments for family, and vacations in private jets and yachts worth up to $500,000 alone.
And the thing that drives me crazy about this with Clarence Thomas and his dumbass is that these are things he could have paid for on his own. That's the thing that kills me. These are things he could have paid for on his own. These are the bribes that you took. God damn. If you're going to take a bribe, Clarence, we'll give you this vacation. Come on out to the Bahamas. You can come hang out with me there. By the way, you can fly on a private jet. That's the bribe you took, son. These are things he could have paid for on his own. Power and money.
In total, Justice Thomas appears to have received more than $1.5 million worth in goods, cash equivalents, and services from Mr. Crow. And that is just what we know of. But truthfully, we won't ever really know the total sum of contributions Thomas received from Crow. Justice Thomas not only accepted these contributions while Mr. Crow had business in front of the court, but he accepted them in secret, failing for years and years to report them. Yet Thomas did report smaller gifts during this time, demonstrating a clear understanding of his legal obligation to report. Would a reasonable American question that receiving lavish gifts from Mr. Crow might lead Justice Thomas to have a bias towards his, quote, friend with business before the court? Without a doubt, yes. But did Justice Thomas recuse? No. Now take Justice Samuel Alito, who has no shortage of billionaire associates of his own. After billionaire Paul Singer gave Justice Alito a luxury fishing trip on a private jet, a contribution that was also hidden from the public and the court, Justice Alito not only refused to recuse, but changed his mind regarding his gracious host's case.
What's interesting about this part of the conversation is when she mentions billionaire associates, all of you guys have billionaire associates. All of you have billionaire associates, man. All of the parties are owned by billionaires. Are you kidding me? That's the funny part.
Just a short time after accepting the lavish undisclosed trip from Singer, Alito joined the court in reversing its previous position and took up Singer's case. He did not recuse. Justice Alito also refused to recuse in the case itself, ultimately leading to a ruling that netted Singer $2.4 billion. And that ruling did not just enrich Singer. It also structurally tilted the playing field further away from working people and towards the vulture funds, siphoning money and resources away from the communities that need them most. Could a reasonable American question whether or not Justice Alito could have acted impartially in this case, given his personal relationship with Singer? Absolutely. In January 2021, after the former president of the United States incited an insurrection on the Capitol in this chamber to interfere with the results of the U.S. election, Justice Samuel Alito and his wife flew an upside-down American flag, a symbol of solidarity with the attack, outside their home. 2 years later, they publicly displayed outside their home yet another incendiary symbol, a flag associated with extreme right-wing Christian nationalism.
So now people are responsible for what they do outside of their home. So this brings up another issue. You know, like, I don't agree with that, what he did, but this brings up another issue. How far does this go? And what you do on your property, is that grounds for impeachment? When people bring up the Bill Clinton impeachment, I think the difference is that he was screwing an intern at the White House. At the White House. But are they responsible for what they do at their own home? Because he flew an upside down flag? Is he responsible for that? There's something we need to start thinking about, guys.
Justice Alito maintains that his wife, Martha Ann Alito, is the only one responsible for the flags. But common sense maintains that such a close and incendiary revelation requires recusal by the justice from January 6th related cases. Despite the overwhelming appearance of a conflict of interest, Justice Alito refused to recuse himself from cases surrounding the 2020 election and questions of the former president's legal immunity in the attack.
Of course, he's not going to recuse himself. It's all partisan. This is what I said before. Even the Supreme Court, it's partisan. When we have a Republican president, they appoint conservative justices. When we have a Democrat, president, they appoint Democrat justices. So it would be nice to have a Supreme Court that didn't have lifetime appointments. Number one, I don't agree with the lifetime appointments. I never got a lifetime appointment in any job I had. At will employment only. Okay. That's what the state law says. But I don't agree with that. And it would be nice if we had a Supreme Court that was not partisan. That would be nice. And see how justices would rule then.
Would a reasonable person question that Justice Alito's conduct exhibits and demonstrates reasonable concern for bias in these cases? Absolutely, and without question. And finally, Justice Thomas, who is married to Virginia Thomas, a financially and personally involved operative in the Stop the Steal movement and Capitol attack, also joined opinions in these cases, even as clear evidence mounted that not only was his wife fully committed to overthrowing the results of a fair election, but she was actively lobbying members of the Trump administration attempting to do just that.
So it sounds like to me the solution to all of this is to remove corporate money. Remove corporate money from electoral politics. Remove it from the courts. To me, that is the solution. You have to get the corporate money out. I mean, again, SCOTUS just said it's okay to take bribes. You have politicians, AOC's talking about lobbying. How many of the politicians are avoiding lobbyists? Most of them are bought and paid for. How many of your congressmen and women have grassroots campaigns? Most of them don't. So the way that you fix this all across the board is you remove the corporate money from these institutions. And until that changes, we're always going to have corrupt politicians, and we're always going to have corrupt judges and justices. And this is not new. Even if you look on the local level, you have judges that have been bought off. People that have money, rich people, they have made it so in certain instances where they will get a certain judge so that they will not be held accountable in court. When you're rich, you can pay for the judge that you want. So you have to get the money out. Until then, you'll always have corruption. So AOC has filed articles of impeachment against Clarence Thomas and Alito, and we will see where this goes. Again, I don't think these mofos are innocent. I think they're guilty as hell. But I think that this is a political move by AOC to enrich herself in her career and to move up in that DNC, the DNC bubble ladder. That's what she's trying to do, move up in the ranks of the party. Because like I said, where's that same type of energy towards Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Ro Khanna for their behavior? Where's that energy? Where was that same energy from AOC when Tara Reade reached out to her and said, listen, this happened to me. Please don't support Joe Biden. Did AOC even give Tara Reade the time of day, misbelieve women? No, she did not give her the time of day because it was her party. And there were a number of people that Tara Reade reached out to, by the way, that ignored it because it was a Democrat. And that's one of the problems that I have with partisan politics. Are we going to be fair, or are we only going to do what works for the party that we belong to? We'll have to wait and see. She definitely could have filed those articles last year when it was reported, but she waited until it was election year, and she's up for re-election. Pay attention, folks.